Hello, everyone. It falls to me today to introduce Mark, which is a great pleasure. Mark is a PhD, having completed his thesis on usable and secure computing at RWTH Aachen University, where he studied computer science and information security. He's presently serving as the data protection officer for a medical company, which is on a mission to detect breast cancer. He's been a software security and privacy engineer for about 11 years. And the central idea from his research is that human behaviors, beliefs, and motivations can't be excluded from solution design, which sounds like a sound idea to me worth spending time on. Mark used to work at LogMeIn, who are a company that handle all kinds of authentication and remote access problems. And he worked there as the manager of application security. It was there that he helped create the privacy suit to the popular Elevation of Privilege game. You can see some of that on your screen. Which is an extension to the game that handles mostly privacy concerns. The game itself focused on security, and we introduced that to Leeds Digital Festival audiences in real life when that was possible at last year's event. So Mark will be introducing his privacy extension tonight. We're really grateful to have him. So thanks, Mark. Over to you.
So hello to everybody. I'm really sorry I can't be there physically. Would have been a 1 month's travel, 2 weeks currently on the way out, 2 weeks on the way back. So we decided to turn this into a virtual event, although I might have enjoyed the 1 month's holiday. Let's see what we're having on the agenda tonight. I'm going to split the talk into 3 larger topics. First topic being about strap modeling a little bit, and specifically why strap modeling with cards makes sense. Then the next topic is going to be how the privacy suit for the Elevation of Privilege card game has been developed and why it makes sense to talk about data protection and privacy during strap modeling. And then the last block is going to be my practical advice and like tricks and tips for running the game and introducing the practice of Elevation of Privilege games into your organization. I already received a very nice introduction. What I would like to highlight that I have an engineering background, so I like to look at things in an abstract and diagramized way, and I daily fight to keep my privacy by keeping away from Facebook, Google, and co-products. So I have a real feeling of the pain, what it is like to try to keep your privacy in today's world. Starting with the initial topic then, which is strap modeling, and then strap modeling with cards specifically. There is one core belief which drives my interpretation how you should be doing strap modeling. And with my experience so far, it seems to be true. And the point where I don't believe in this anymore might be a whole path of career for myself. But I strongly believe that developers want to write secure code. The reason I think so is because looking at the engineers, if you're able to engage them in a project, I always see them happily doing task until it's really done. Most of the engineers are going to have some kind of hobby project where they further try to develop their skills. Hence, if although security has been around for quite a while and the practices haven't really changed so much, we don't really seem to have solved this issue. And my idea why this is so is by splitting the problem into 2 areas. One is the problem for some environmental parameters you're not considering appropriately. Whereas on the other side, there are coding errors which simply stem from the fact that humans make mistakes. We work under stress, we try to multitask, although we are very bad at it, or we don't have the tools to write good code. To bring differentiation a bit closer with terms most of us are very familiar with, a coding error would be like this crack on a wall. It's not like a fundamental flaw that causes this. It's probably an error in the use of materials, in the implementation of how the wall has been built, how the paint has been put on it, eventually a little bit of miscalculation in how the temperature variation is going to affect the building. This error might grow larger and cause a significant issue, or it might just stay as it is, put some paint over it, and that's it. On the other hand, flaws are situations where someone fundamentally didn't understand what's going to happen. When there was a misalignment between teams on what the expectations are, or there was a conceptual misunderstanding of the technology on the purpose, intent, and so on. Now, threat modeling is intended to help with the case of flaws. So when you look at the system from a design perspective and try to clarify exactly these circumstances, parameters, environmental constraints. And how we do this with software is usually by creating a diagram, creating some kind of abstraction, and by looking at the abstraction and getting a complete understanding of how the system works, you might be able to identify these kind of flaws, or how we're going to call them going forward, threats. So here comes the quiz, Simon mentioned. So what you see here is a diagram of a system with two parties. One is the customer, the other is a supplier here in pinkish, reddish, whatever color you might call this, and the customer being blue. So what the customer does, he has networking devices he would like to manage, remotely monitor, and push updates to, whereas the supplier is exactly the middle piece who establishes the connection to all those networking devices and can help distribute or push firmware updates. So what the quiz is about is that this system has a very fundamental and severe flaw in it. So the flaw you see here is that the customer provides, or the customer prepares a firmware package he wants to push to his devices. He's going to upload upload the URL of this firmware package, which he hosts himself, to the supplier through an admin interface he has access to. This admin interface is then going to trigger the component which keeps the connection with all the networking devices. The firmware broker is then going to download the firmware from that URL the customer provided. We trust that the customer is preparing a firmware which is valid and secure, because he's going to push it later to his own devices. So it doesn't make sense for the customer to create like a malicious package he's then pushing to his own devices. So the firmware broker is then downloading this package and pushing it to all the networking devices. If you know the solution to this, please write it into the chat. Pay attention to only send it to the panelists. And HR Stationery was so kind to offer a quite significant prize for the winner. So the first person who writes the proper answer into the chat is going to be the winner for this. And please also include your email address so we can reach out to you regarding shipping and so on. I'm going to pull out this diagram later on in the talk multiple times, so you don't have to remember all of this now. So threat modeling for software systems, as I said, creates a diagram or an abstraction of the system and then analyzes this to identify threats. Now, Adam Shostak, who created the Elevation of Privilege card game, says that threat modeling basically consists of asking 4 questions, and you can apply different methods how you are asking those 4 questions, but the 4 questions in general are always, what are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we doing about it? And did we do a good job? So I have a personal take on how you should be looking at these 4 questions. Starting from the beginning, what are we working on? In many organizations, what you see how this is done is the developers create some kind of documentation, which they then pass over to a security team who is then going to do the strap modeling part. Now, my belief is that developers and security engineers should be sitting in the same room and working on the same diagram and discussing the scope of the strap modeling together. Reason simply being that most of you probably are aware of the game when a person whispered, or people stand in line, or children stand in line, and the first child whispers like a phrase to the second child, and this phrase is passed on. And at the end, you usually end up with some very confusing phrase. Now, if you then have the security team basically working out of this distorted picture the initial developer provided, you basically guarantee that the requirements or constraints they are going to be looking at is going to be significantly false. And then if you use the same distorted channel to then provide the feedback from the security team back to the developer is simply going to ignore whatever input he receives from the security team because it's not going to be relevant anymore for his system. So I really think that the scope and the understanding of the system needs to be established by working together. Now looking at the next two questions, which are what can go wrong and what are we going to do about it? I think it's even more important here to pull in all the members of the team and have the security engineer understand all the aspects of how the system works. And then basically the security engineer being a facilitator of a conversation, picking on the knowledge the individual engineers have about how the system works, instead of the security engineer coming in with assumptions and just throwing around with threats he thinks could be possible. And then similarly, if you pick the knowledge from the engineer of what might go wrong, then you further can use that knowledge to come up with a proper control, which is not unrealistic for the particular system. So this sounds all very nice. Taking away the complete development team or engineering team and doing this kind of exercise. Now, usually the reaction I received from product managers or engineering managers, whoever managed the resources, when I came in saying that, hey, I'd like to have your complete team for around 3 hours, was like this. Now, you might think that my opinion on this is that they don't understand the importance of security, or they don't prioritize appropriately. But actually, I completely understand them. Because what's very important, which for some reason a lot of departments around the development team don't consider, is that any kind of process or activity that you introduce takes away from the time where people could be doing what they're actually being paid for. Hence, if you are using their time, there should be only 2 reasons ever to do so, with A being that the activity that you're introducing actually increases the value of the work they're doing, or B, it is motivational for them. Like that's why you do team building exercises, or you do offsites, because you want to keep your employees happy, you want them motivated, you want them to be good team players. So these are the only 2 reasons I see which allow to take away from the time where people can do the work they are intended to be doing. And now what I'm saying here is that doing strap modeling with cards does both of these at the same time. Because surprisingly, whenever you tell a group of engineers, hey, I want to play a card game with you, they really get excited. Like I had a bunch of times engineers come to me and say, hey, shall we take the strap modeling cards with us to the pub and try it out? It's like, it's not that kind of a game. Like it doesn't work like that. Still, if you can get that initial excitement, that means that you already have the engineers on your side, you got them motivated, you got them interested in what this is about. And then through the mechanics of the game, you can tell the respective manager that what you're going to do with them is going to involve actively all the participants of the session, and is going to exploit the knowledge about the system of each individual participant, meaning that first of all, you're going to increase the awareness of the complete team, meaning that in the future, you're going to have to deal with less security issues. And also you're actively going to be using the team's knowledge to identify most of the issues which might be in the system right now. So putting the two players to show, which we're actually talking about, are the Elevation of Privilege card game and the Cornucopia card game. Elevation of Privilege having been developed by Adam Shostak and his colleagues at Microsoft, and Cornucopia coming from the OWASP Foundation. And I strongly recommend both of these, but each in their own application area. So with Cornucopia, what's very important is, although it's always in fine print, to see that this is an e-commerce website edition. So this really works well and has very specific topics if you're dealing with a traditional website. Whereas Elevation of Privilege is a bit more abstract, meaning that you probably need more experienced engineers or more support from a security engineer in using it. However, the areas where you can apply it is going to be way broader. So how is going strap milling session look like with these 4 questions if you use the Elevation of Privilege card game? Well, the question of what are we working on is pretty similar. You're going to create a diagram. The difference being that this diagram is now going to be put on the whiteboard or on the beamer during the session, so everyone has a common reference point. What can go wrong is being discussed by playing cards, whereas each card talks about a particular threat which you should be looking at, and then the engineer is supposed to, or the group, through a discussion, is then looking whether this threat applies to their system and whether there is any kind of protection within the system, and if not, what kind of controls should be introduced. And then did we do a good job is later reviewing whether the scope has been set properly, whether all the suits have been played through, you have a good enough understanding of the various topics of the strap milling cards and how these apply to your system to get the job done. So let's look at 2 examples of these cards. First being the 7 of Elevation of Privilege, which talks about providing a pointer across a transboundary instead of data. Now, most of the security attacks always go in through passing some kind of malicious data into your system. So if your system is handling pointers, which then the validation can't check what kind of data is going to be behind that pointer at the time of use, it's possible to provide malicious data to the system. Whereas the 7 of spoofing talks about an attacker can connect to a server or peer over a link that isn't authenticated, meaning an attacker is able to step into the role of a legitimate user of the system and use or interact with the system in an unintended way. Now, I picked these 2 cards for a specific reason, because these might hint at the solution at the quiz that we have. And this concludes the first block for a session. Which is about adding data protection and privacy to the threat modeling. Now, to cut the story short, the reason I decided to add privacy to threat modeling was because what I experienced was that many of the topics security has to deal with closely relate to the requirements privacy is then going to provide. And there's a very specific requirement within GDPR called data protection by design, or most commonly known as privacy by design. But GDPR isn't very specific of what this should be meaning, how you should be doing this. The original term originates from the Information Commissioner in Canada, who established 7 principles being part of privacy by design. These being that privacy should be the default setting, that privacy should be proactive, not reactive, that it needs to be embedded into the design, that it needs to be user-centric, that use of personal data needs to be visible and transparent, that requiring privacy shouldn't limit your functionality, but you should receive full functionality, then you need to embed end-to-end security. Now, again, these phrases sound nice, but they don't really bring you closer into translating these into engineering terms. However, looking at the specific, or when translating the requirements of GDPR into engineering terms, what I found was that the main discussion is always going to be what is personal data. And that's why it's so hard to talk with engineers about this, because with security, if you set the context, if you set the motivation, it's similarly to other engineering things, it's black or white. Whereas with privacy, you're going to end up with a lot of personal interpretation or contextual questions. Like if I just ask the audience now, would you consider Google Analytics session cookie personal data? I'm pretty sure we're going to receive different answers for that. So what I realized is, instead of trying to come up with a perfect solution to how to do privacy by design, and instead of trying to get a complete understanding for each system what personal data is, having an 80% good solution for handling security and privacy is still 80% better than not trying or giving up halfway because the methodology is too difficult. This is a similar argument I have with security a lot of times when people come up with very specific cases, loopholes of avoiding some kind of security control. Security shouldn't be dealing with very specific, unlikely cases when we are usually struggling with handling the basics. Once we have all the basics in place, obviously the attack is going to come in with the very specific case. But just because a control isn't handling all the cases, just 80% of them, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be implementing the solution first, which does 80%. Similarly, I did another talk where I talked about the Pareto principle in security, which is very true, again, that by solving for 20% of the causes, you are solving for 80% of the security problems which might be in your system. So with that, what the privacy suit is really trying to do is moving the whole topic of security threat modeling into the realm of privacy, because what I've seen is that most of the requirements you are dealing with in terms of software security come from requirements which are actually related to privacy. And also, if you look at the different fines which supervisory authorities are issuing and the reasonings behind them, you'll see that most of the activities a company has to deal with to be compliant with GDPR somehow reflect security activities, not very specific privacy activities. So in reality, I would say, and that's my opinion, that the whole threat modeling exercise is actually a privacy exercise, not a security exercise. But that's something I can't say just now. So what I'm saying is, let's add the topic of privacy to all the security discussions that you have. And how I then implemented the topics which should be discussed during threat modeling is that, fortunately, I have been working at that time with a lot of different products and projects, all having very different development teams, different cultural backgrounds, different business environments. And when we did the GDPR gap analysis for all of these projects, obviously a bunch of issues came out, some of these being very specific to an individual product. But a large number of these topics which had to be handled were very common between these products. Now, just having identified the topics you want to handle is only half of the story. Because as I initially decided, I wanted to put this into the strap modeling sessions, and it's very specific who participates in a strap modeling session, what kind of people are there, and what kind of discussions you're having. And here came my background with user-centered design, that instead of trying to simply write down my expertise or experience in privacy and give it to the people, I applied a very iterative process, going many, many rounds in terms of topics to be discussed, in terms of what the understanding of the people of these topics are, how to abstract these at a level which still can be applied to many systems, but isn't just too vague. And that's how then the actual privacy cards came to life. So let's look at some very specific cards we have in the suite, just to show to you why they really cover topics which are current, actual, and should be considered with any system. Start with privacy-friendly settings. The reaction of every team basically is going to be, sure, our system is not coming with the most privacy-friendly settings. And I have to agree. But if you look at those systems which are being most watched by supervisory authorities, or which have the largest impact on people's life, you'll see that these companies, talking about Facebook, Google, and the like, were continuously pushed over the past years to change their default settings into more privacy-friendly settings, to the point where now if you start a Facebook account, you start with a quite restricted set of people, for example, you are going to share your data with. Obviously, Facebook is going to have a bunch of other problems still, but you see that the general environment is in pushing these companies towards making their default settings more privacy friendly. The next card is a very engineering focused card, which says that personal data in your system is missing pointers to data subjects, hence the data is forgotten when the owner is deleted or makes a request for access. Now, I'm pretty sure everyone heard about the right to be forgotten requirement in GDPR and how this relates to current widely applied technologies is that nowadays, because storage is cheap, we tend to use a lot of like streaming data stores or unstructured NoSQL buckets, which then are going to have very weak pointers into the structured database you have, if you have any kind of structured database. And if you don't consider this requirement during the design, what you're going to end up with is whenever there's a change in your structured data, you either are not going to be able to change the unstructured data to look, it's not indexed that way. Like right to be forgotten requests are coming in like plenty to all companies. If you don't optimize for this, you're basically going to kill your database with all these queries. Looking at the next card, which is Privacy 7, which says your system is not following through on personal data deletion in integrated third parties. Now, what you see here is a really simplified ecosystem of third-party applications any modern web application is going to be using. Like most places I go to are going to have way more than these. So this is really a very minimal set when you are having a connected CRM, you're having a connected marketing web page with, let's say, a forum in it. You're going to have a mailing list. You're going to outsource your authentication system. And probably you are having some kind of pass-based database. So a lot of companies realize that when a right to be forgotten requests comes in that they need to delete data in their own database, but actually you are completely responsible for following through with all your third parties. And if your third parties are using further vendors, then you have to go down all the way and be sure that whatever person data you passed into that chain gets deleted. And then looking at the card, which gave the title of this talk, which is your system is processing personal data in countries or with third parties, which have weak privacy standards. We just recently had the topic with Zoom, who turned out that during the setup of meetings, basically randomly, they might be using servers in China to set up the meeting of non-Chinese participants. And the requirement of GDPR is that throughout the life cycle of data, no matter which country or third party it travels to, it has to uphold to the same standard that the initial system had. So let's see if we already have any solution to our quiz. No? So I'll give you guys another hint for finding the flaw in this. So I did highlight a little bit more explicitly, like who has control of the data at which point, and also which way data is going to be flowing. And also I added another card, which says that an attacker can anonymously connect because we expect authentication to be then done at a higher level. So these are the 3 hints you get to identify the flaw, the design flaw in the system. And this concludes our block on privacy. And the next topic is going to be looking at the game a little bit more, how to play the game and how to make the most of the sessions that you're going to do.
All right, everybody, welcome to game night. Tonight we're going to be playing Risky Settlers, Knights and Allies of the Lords of Dominion of Earth, Pandemic Edition. Now, we've all played before, but Link, this is your first time, right?
Yeah, but I mean, just get started. I'm sure I'll catch on.
Well, everybody, start with picking a color and taking 3 cards. Oh, don't look at them yet. Now we roll the dice. Link, you rolled a 2. That means you get to roll the mega die. You rolled a 14. That means you get 3 jumbo resource cards. Don't look at them yet. Now we all grab items from the game chest that correspond to our item cards.
I've got a crystal card.
Okay, everybody provide 2 forms of identification, one for you in real life and one for your character in the game.
I've just got my license.
Well, I guess we'll be playing with a rodent entrapment expansion pack then. Now, swab your neighbor's mouth for a DNA sample. Now wait 5 to 10 business days for the results. Okay, now check your results and take the corresponding actions. Yeah, you got a predisposition to restless leg syndrome. You only get 1 more card. Now take and eat a piece of whey bread. You put your left hand in, you put your left hand out, you put your left hand in, and you shake it all about. Now regurgitate your whey bread into your money bag. Dodger, you get to pop the biosphere to see how many newborns are present for the firstborn prophecy. 2. Okay, the prophecies agreed. The crystal bearer must retrieve a blooming elderberry from the north-facing slope of Mount Glocknerwand. What number am I thinking of?
2?
No, 8. Now get 8 tattooed on your left butt cheek.
Wait a second, you wanted the word 8, right? Like I just ate, not the number 8.
No.
Oh.
Left hand ogre. Snake Eyes! We get to release the bandit! Do the cinnamon challenge.
Do the Harlem
Milk yourself. Oh, you lose. Time to cut off your left pinky finger.
So the rules for evaluation of privilege aren't that complicated, but I'm not going to go into details on the rules here. First, they are quite simple. Second, they're included in the box. And third, there are other talks you can watch online, which are going to explain how to run the game. What I'm more going to focus here is my experience with running the game at many different organizations, how you can start establishing the practice of regularly using elevation of privilege, how you can make sure to take away the most when using it. And basically, I'm going to go through the life cycle of running a session, which starts with setting up the meeting and setting expectations for the participants, selecting your participants. Then once in the session, setting the environment, setting a constructive mood, tricks to moderate the discussions, and then after the session, what kind of follow-up to do to make sure that you actually take benefit from this exercise. And then, as most of the people have or are working from home, see how you can still use elevation of privilege these days. So setting up meeting expectations, what I had to learn very quickly is that you can very quickly start with a bad reputation or a bad mood if you don't exactly follow, no matter how pragmatic or complicated the development process of a team is. You need to follow the rules when you try to introduce elevation of privilege sessions. So for example, if your team is using Scrum, then make sure to make threat modeling into a ticket on their backlog, which then they are going to include in their planning session and are going to commit to in their sprint. Similarly, very often hearing that the system they are developing is either too complicated or too large or too small or too simple or whatever kind of excuse that it's not possible to strap all this. Now, what I can say is that by creating the diagram before the threat session and agreeing on a level of abstraction which provides for a reasonable sized diagram, I never had a system which we couldn't strap model with elevation of privilege, and there wasn't one single session where we didn't identify at least one high-risk threat in that system, which is a really, really strong statement, but absolutely true from my experience. You always identify something. Selecting the participants. So I did touch on this earlier, that you should be having various expertise during the session. And apart from a couple of roles, like a dedicated Scrum Master is probably not going to be able to contribute a lot to the discussion, or a business analyst might only be able to talk about the privacy issues. I think most of the roles within an engineering team should participate in the threat modeling, because the front-end developer is not going to know what kind of controls the database has, and the back-end engineer is not going to know what kind of controls the DevOps team has put into the infrastructure or into the build pipeline. And very often when talking about various functionalities, pieces of the code which only a couple of people are going to be aware of can turn out to have like a roll-on effect when looked through the individual parts of the system. Also, in terms of number of people participating, additionally to the person facilitating the meeting or the security engineer, I would say participant number from 4 to 6 is quite good. Below that, you'll simply struggle with the amount of cards that you have, and above that is going to be too large to have like constructive discussions, and you might have people basically turn into bystanders because they are too rarely, their turn is not often enough for them to get engaged. Also, what I like to do is, if the team is really large, to split the same system into 2 separate sessions with mostly distinct participants. I'm going to touch on this why in a moment. Very important is setting the environment of the session, the mood, the atmosphere. Because very often you're going to have engineers who will come in the session with a very defensive posture, because you're actually discussing critically a system they have invested a lot of time in and have developed themselves. So it's very important to see if anyone is being defensive or sensitive about the session, and try to feel them at ease, that this session is not about criticizing their work. The whole atmosphere of playing a game does help with this a lot, because it puts people into a different mindset. But there are a bunch of rules I always call out at the beginning of every session. First being that this should be considered a brainstorming session, hence everything is allowed. You can talk about the rogue admin, you can talk about forced entrance, you can talk about someone being bribed. Just by making it clear that everything is allowed, people are going to ease up way more and don't take it that drastically if they're seeing issues within their system. Also, the session should be about collecting as many possible issues as possible. So getting into the discussions of how a fix should be implemented, or why something has been implemented a particular way because of lack of resources or particular constraints, or start talking about likelihoods of actual attacks, you need to cut those discussions down. There's going to be a follow-up session where these discussions are very relevant when you are assessing the risk of the issues, but the elevation of privilege session should be about identifying as many issues as possible. And then to make sure that no one tries to basically be a bystander and get over their turn as quickly as possible, what you're going to see is mostly that people say a particular issue doesn't apply. And that's absolutely possible, but then they should specifically state why it isn't applicable, because there is some specific control in the system which protects against it, or because the system works in a particular way, in which case that kind of threat doesn't apply. And just by having people call out the controls and the design, you might start discussions which, although a little bit more, or interpreting the card a bit more liberally, but might disclose issues which are relevant or related to the card. Now, you'll see that during the elevation of privilege session, sometimes you need to slow the discussion down and allow for people to dive a bit more deeply into how the system operates, because that's when they will start to question the assumptions they have within the system and analyze how components interplay. And sometimes, just to use time effectively, you will have to speed the discussion up. And here, referring to why I like to split the session, is that mostly around 2/3 into the session, there are going to be like 2-3 root issues which they're then going to relate any card to. And if you have 2 separate sessions where the second session is not aware of what were the issues which have been fixated on in the previous one, there's a high chance you're going to get another 2 or 3 completely different issues which you can then take away. So if you don't want to lose face and actually take or benefit from having done this exercise, you must make sure that any issue you identified is being followed up on. And how I usually do this is by doing a follow-up session with a representative from the engineering side and taking a PM, whatever a PM is going to stand for in your organization, whether he's a product manager or project manager or whatever, because he's going then to bring in the business perspective to the discussion. And very often, an issue a developer might see as severe, or even might look at as being a no-brainer, the business side might change the priorities on how important it is to deal with that issue. So, and as the last part, let's see what you can do nowadays when you have to play the game with everyone being at home. The most simplistic approach is that there is the site eopgame.herokuapp.com, where if you go to this link, you're going to be shown a random card with always a link to go to the next card, basically just making sure that cards are not being repeated. Now, this is obviously a way to go through the cards, but you could just as well have one person having the deck and him reading one card after another and use the cards then as a catalog. On the other side of the spectrum, a little bit too sophisticated is a tabletop simulator implementation of this, which is a very fun way to look at this. It really gives you a game experience because you're moving the cards in a virtual environment and you have like a hand you can see and others can't. But after a while, basically the magic fades away and you just spend too much time with moving the cards on the table and not really focusing on the topics that you are discussing. So I really like the middle ground HDR Stationery came up with, because this still allows you to have physical cards, which will then trigger in you this feeling that you're playing a game. But to solve the whole topic of how do you manage that people have different cards, and like there's actually like a card game aspect to this, the tool allows you to generate hands for each player before the session. So people come into the session by taking their own physical copy of the cards, which might be, I don't know, a set of 5 cards the company is using, and you always hand it over to your colleagues, or having everyone having a separate deck. And then before the session, people can pull out the cards they're going to be using during the session. It also gives them an additional chance to look at their cards, but if they just invest the amount of time that at the beginning of the meeting they pull out the cards, it still allows to play a good game with a kind of realistic experience. So that's all I had in mind. We talked about why strap modeling helps identify systematic flaws and how turning that into a card game can help you introduce the practice of strap modeling into your organization. We talked about why the principle of privacy by design is very abstract and why translating those into cards and adding those to your strap modeling can make sense. And then we talked a little bit about practical approaches of running the game and some very good resources you can find and materials.